The glass walls of the horizon spire shimmered like liquid gold as the last ribbons of sunset draped themselves across Neo-San Francisco. From the 86th floor observatory, the city unfolded beneath Dr. Naomi Carter like a living constellation. Its elevated transit rails glowing cobalt, its hovering skydocks pulsing with steady light, its avenues humming with the quiet rhythm of a metropolis reborn by innovation. Tonight, the skyline felt different. Tonight, it belonged to her. Naomi stood near the panoramic window, her reflection a dark silhouette wrapped in the soft blush of twilight. She looked regal, her natural coils swept into an elegant updo, a silk-tailored suit in deep garnet draping her frame with effortless confidence. Yet her eyes, warm, expressive, and touched with an old, unspoken ache, held the true story of the evening. The acquisition of Whitaker Systems had been finalized just 30 minutes earlier. The empire once ruled by Evan Whitaker, the man she had loved fiercely and lost painfully, now bore her name on every legal document. The city's news drones were still circling the tower, their metallic wings buzzing with anticipation. Headlines flashed across digital billboards. Carter Dynamics absorbs Whitaker Systems in historic takeover. Naomi Carter, from co-architect to conqueror. A full circle written in data and destiny. But Naomi felt neither triumph nor vindication, only a profound, almost tender sense of completion. Her hands rested lightly on the cold glass as the wind whispered against the building. The very city Evan once promised they would reshape together, now stretched at her feet, reshaped by her alone. His absence lingered like a faint echo, but it no longer stung. It was simply part of the architecture of her history. "Dr. Carter," murmured her assistant, stepping into the room with reverence. "The press is requesting a statement, and there are thousands of messages on the public channel." Naomi smiled softly. "Let them wait a moment. Tonight should breathe." Her assistant nodded and vanished like a shadow, leaving Naomi alone with the skyline, and with the memories that rose like distant waves. She thought of the early days, when Evan's eyes had sparkled at every idea, when he'd held her hand across cluttered desks covered in sketches, formulas, and late-night coffee stains. How bright they had once been, how inevitable they had once seemed. And yet here she stood, not rewriting the past, but reclaiming the future. She lifted the champagne flute beside her, the same crystal Evan had once given her as an anniversary gift, and raised it quietly toward the glass. To the city, to the woman she had grown into, to the version of herself who had learned that love could be both a foundation and a prison, depending on who held the power to define the story. Her lips curved upward, gentle, luminous. "Here's to new chapters," she whispered. Outside, the neon lights shimmered, as if in agreement. Naomi turned slightly, catching a fuller glimpse of her reflection. Not the Naomi who once stood in Evan's shadow, seeking his approval, molding herself into his grand ambition, but a woman who had rebuilt herself with intention, integrity, and unshakable clarity. The kind of woman who did not merely rise, she ascended. A notification chimed softly on the nearby console, the official public live stream awaiting her presence. She would speak soon, calmly, graciously, without spectacle. She wanted people not to witness a conquest, but a transformation. Naomi's footsteps carried her toward the private broadcasting room, each step steady as a heartbeat. Yet just before she crossed the threshold, she paused, casting one last look at the sprawling horizon. How strange, she thought, that the greatest victories rarely roar. Sometimes they arrive as a whisper, a quiet knowing that you have finally stepped into who you were meant to be. With that truth shimmering in her chest, she entered the room where millions waited to hear her voice. And as the soft studio lights illuminated her face, she offered her audience the same serene smile she had given the city. "Thank you for joining me tonight," she began warmly, her voice drifting like silk. "If this moment inspires you, if it reminds you that rebuilding is possible, that resilience carries its own kind of poetry, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share, to comment, to stay connected. We are, after all, writing these stories together. Her gaze deepened, rich with promise. And this is only the beginning. The winter light in Detroit had a way of softening things, as if the city itself understood how much it had endured and chose, in small mercies, to be gentle where it could. That afternoon, the sky was a pale silver, the kind that made street lamps glow earlier than necessary and turned passing cars into streaks of muted color. Snowmelt glistened along the curbs, and the air carried that faint, metallic chill unique to cities born of steel and sweat. Inside the small cafe on the corner of Jefferson and Rio Pell, warmth gathered in quiet layers, steam from espresso machines, low music drifting from hidden speakers, the faint murmur of conversation. The place was a sort of refuge for people who carried big ideas in overworked bodies. Grad students, activists, engineers, dreamers who needed a table, a charger, and something stronger than sleep. Naomi Carter sat by the window, a worn leather notebook open in front of her, pen resting between her fingers. She had come straight from a meeting at the Detroit branch of the Federal Reserve, still wearing her navy sheath dress and charcoal coat, though she had unbuttoned the top of her blouse to breathe more freely. Numbers and projections filled the page, urban recovery models, infrastructure allocations, half-sketched diagrams of transit flows. She was, in every sense, in her element. Her dark brown eyes traced the lines she had drawn, making small corrections in the margins. She loved the logic of it all, the way an economy could tell a story if you listened carefully enough. Who was forgotten? Who was overvalued? Who was silently keeping everything from collapsing? Detroit had taught her that numbers were never just numbers. They were neighborhoods, paychecks, lights switching on or staying off. The door to the cafe chimed softly as it opened, sending a brief gust of winter air across the room. Naomi didn't look up at first. She was used to the ebb and flow of people. It wasn't until a voice at the counter rose above the murmur, bright with enthusiasm and utterly unconcerned with blending in, that something tugged at her attention. "No, not the house blend," the voice said, amused. "If I'm about to pitch the future of urban logistics, I need something more dramatic than that." The barista laughed. "So, double espresso with a reckless amount of ambition?" "That," he replied, "is exactly my brand." Naomi's mouth curved slightly, despite herself. She lifted her gaze, and that was the first time she saw him. Evan Whitaker stood at the counter in a wool coat the color of smoke, a scarf half untied around his throat, snowflakes still melting in his light brown hair. He was unmistakably out of place, and yet oddly at home. A white man with the kind of easy, boyish handsomeness that usually belonged to someone who had never had to prove he deserved to be in the room. But there was an earnestness about him that disarmed that assumption. The way he leaned forward when he spoke, as if the barista's opinion truly mattered. The way his hands punctuated his words, sketching invisible shapes in the air. He accepted his espresso with a grateful grin, then scanned the crowded cafe for a seat. For a moment, his gaze swept past Naomi, then returned, drawn as if by gravity. She was half hidden behind her notebook, but something about the way she sat, upright yet relaxed, focused but not closed, caught his attention. "Excuse me," he said, stepping closer, voice softening as he approached her table. "Is anyone sitting here?" Naomi glanced at the empty chair across from her, then back at him. There was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes, the kind that could easily become teasing if invited. "Not unless you're counting economic models as people," she replied. He smiled, and it was like watching a room grow brighter by a single, decisive watt. "I respect their right to exist, but I promise I won't take their seat." She considered him for a heartbeat, then nodded toward the chair. "Go ahead." He set his cup down carefully, slipping off his coat with a slightly clumsy grace that made him seem less like a polished CEO and more like a grad student who had misread the dress code. When he finally settled in, he offered his hand across the table. "I'm Evan," he said, Evan Whitaker. Naomi, she replied, taking his hand. His grip was warm, firm, but not performative. Naomi Carter. Naomi Carter, he repeated, as if trying on the sound of it. That is a name that belongs on a book cover. She raised a brow. And what would the book be about? Changing the way cities live and breathe, he said without missing a beat. Obviously, the answer was ridiculous, and yet there was something disarming in the way he said it, as if he had wandered into her world, already convinced that she played a central role in it. Her pen tapped lightly against the notebook. And what brings you to this particular corner of urban respiration? He tilted his espresso in a half toast. Desperation and caffeine. I'm about to meet with some potential investors. I needed a quiet place to pull my thoughts together, or at least pretend they were together to begin with. He hesitated, then added, I'm building a company, well, trying to. A platform called Flow Logic. Naomi's curiosity sharpened. Flow Logic, she repeated. What does it do? Evan leaned forward, and something in him shifted. The affable charm remained, but beneath it, a deeper current surfaced. Focus, conviction, the unmistakable hum of someone who believes so fiercely in his idea that the world seems smaller for not having implemented it yet. Cities, he began, are full of moving parts that don't talk to each other. Trucks, trains, drones, ships. Everyone's optimizing their own little corner, but no one's orchestrating the whole thing. It's wasteful, it's chaotic, and it leaves communities like this one waiting longer and paying more. He gestured toward the window, where the streets of Detroit stretched into the fading light. Flow Logic, he continued, is an AI-driven logistics system that integrates all of that. Real-time routing, dynamic adjustments, predictive modeling. We want to make supply chains feel less like gridlock and more like music. Naomi listened, her economist mind already turning the idea over, probing its weaknesses, testing its potential. She could see the flaws, regulatory barriers, infrastructure gaps, the messy reality of public-private cooperation. But she could also see something else, possibility. And who's building these models, she asked. Who's designing the risk frameworks, the pricing algorithms? Your pitch is beautiful, but beautiful ideas have a dangerous habit of collapsing without structure. For a moment, Evan just stared at her. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with delighted recognition. Please tell me you're not just saying that because you like the sound of risk frameworks, he said. Some of us do, she replied dryly. I'm an economist. I work with the Fed. Structure is kind of my love language. He placed a hand theatrically over his chest. Be still, my optimizing heart. She tried not to smile and failed. Evan leaned back, studying her with a new kind of focus. I have a part-time data scientist, a brilliant but overworked engineer, and a former classmate helping me with the legal side, he admitted. But the financial architecture, the risk models, it's been improvised. And not in the jazz sense, more in the thin ice over deep water sense. Naomi glanced down at her notebook, then back at him. She saw the cracks in his plan clearly, but she also saw the sincerity in his gaze and the vulnerability he didn't bother hiding. You're asking investors to trust thin ice, she said quietly. You won't last a winter. I know, he replied. That's why I need someone who understands winter. The words hung between them, simple and startling. Naomi's heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. Nothing grand, nothing cinematic, just a quiet shift, a subtle awareness that something significant was unfolding in this ordinary moment, at this wobbly table with its coffee rings and crumbs. You don't know me, she said gently. I know enough, he countered, his tone soft but certain. You're sitting in a Detroit cafe sketching economic models for a city everyone else wrote off years ago. You see structure where other people see ruins. And you're the first person today who asked how any of this actually works instead of how fast it can scale. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the contours of a future she had not planned for. one that didn't involve staying safely behind institutional walls, but stepping into the unpredictable, exhilarating chaos of building something new. "What are you offering, Evan?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer. He smiled, and this time it was gentler, almost careful. "A chance to build an engine powerful enough to change how cities live. And," he hesitated, the faintest hint of shyness touching his features, "maybe to see what happens when two people who believe in the same future decide to build it side by side." Outside, the sky deepened from silver to indigo. The first stars, hidden by city light, shimmered somewhere beyond the smog and clouds, unseen but present. Inside the cafe, Naomi closed her notebook slowly, as if marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Her fingers rested on the cover for a moment, feeling the familiar texture of worn leather. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his. "Show me your numbers," she said. "Then we'll see about your future." Evan's grin returned, bright and infectious. But this time there was reverence in it, too, as if he understood that something sacred had just shifted in his favor. He slid his tablet across the table, hands trembling just slightly, not from cold, but from hope. And as Naomi began to read, the quiet world of the cafe seemed to shrink around them, wrapping their table in an invisible circle of possibility. Two strangers in Detroit, sharing coffee and data, and the first fragile outlines of a dream neither of them yet knew would one day bring them to the top of a glittering tower, looking down on a city that had taught them both how to fall and how to rise. The months that followed unfolded with the quiet inevitability of destiny, as if the city itself had stepped aside to make room for the story Naomi and Evan were beginning to write together. Detroit, resilient and weathered, became their proving ground. Between its abandoned factories and rising innovation hubs, the two of them found a rhythm, imperfect yet harmonious, driven yet tender. FlowLogic was still more dream than company when Naomi stepped into its orbit. The office was a repurposed warehouse on the riverfront, where cold drafts slipped through cracked windows and the hum of ancient radiators underscored every conversation. But the space held a strange magic, the kind only found in beginnings. Handwritten timelines papered the walls. Whiteboards overflowed with half-formed ideas. Cables snaked across the floor like roots searching for soil. And in the center of it all, there was Evan, leaning over a makeshift desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes bright with a mixture of hope, exhaustion, and belief so luminous it was almost reckless. "You came back," he said, when Naomi entered the warehouse one chilly morning, her breath forming small clouds in the air. "I said I'd review your numbers," she teased softly. "I didn't say I'd freeze while doing it." He rushed to flip on a space heater that whirred like an old lawnmower. "Add adequate heating to the list of things we'll afford once FlowLogic becomes the backbone of every major U.S. city." She shook her head, amused, then opened her laptop, settling into the most stable chair in the room, which wasn't saying much. Yet as she began reviewing Evan's projections, refining them, rebuilding them line by line, something within her unfurled. It wasn't just the intellectual thrill of solving a problem. It was the warmth of possibility, the sense of standing at the threshold of something monumental. And while she worked, Evan watched her with quiet reverence, as if she were coaxing the soul of the company into being. Their days blurred into long stretches of collaboration, calculating, debating, dreaming. Naomi built the financial skeleton of FlowLogic, mapping out scenarios, stress testing their projections, shaping Evan's vision into an architecture sturdy enough to withstand the world's scrutiny. Evan, for his part, trusted her without hesitation. He brought her into every conversation, engineering, design, investor calls, treating her not simply as a partner, but as the missing force his ideas had always needed. Late nights became their shared language. Naomi would sit cross-legged on the floor, stacks of reports around her, while Evan scribbled algorithms on a whiteboard, pausing only to glance over and ask, "Does this make sense?" Or, How would you structure this? Sometimes he'd bring her warm ginger tea when he noticed her shivering. Sometimes she'd gently tap the marker out of his hand when he was working himself into a frenzy. They learned each other's rhythms. They learned each other's strengths. They learned each other. And in the spaces between the spreadsheets and prototypes, something tender grew. One evening, after a grueling investor meeting that nearly fell apart, they found themselves alone in the warehouse again. Naomi had saved the pitch at the last minute, offering a financial model so compelling that even the most skeptical investor paused, leaned in, and finally nodded. Evan hadn't stopped looking at her since. "You carried us today," he murmured, leaning against the desk, his hair tousled from running his hands through it 100 times. "I would have drowned without you." "You would have learned to swim," she said softly, though her heart gave a traitorous flutter. "Maybe." He took a tentative step closer. "But I don't want to build this without you, Naomi." The words were simple, but they fell between them like a vow. Her heart thudded in a quiet, aching way. She had always known she was capable, brilliant, driven, unshakable. But hearing it from him, hearing it not as flattery but as truth, stirred something deeper than ambition. "Then don't," she replied. He exhaled, relieved, almost disbelieving. "Stay," he whispered. "Build this with me." When she nodded, his eyes softened in a way she hadn't seen before, as if she had just illuminated a room he'd been wandering through in the dark. As flow logic took shape, their connection deepened with a natural grace. They learned each other's vulnerabilities, Naomi's tendency to carry burdens alone, Evan's fear of disappointing the people he admired. They learned each other's desires, not just for the company, but for life, for purpose, for belonging. And sometimes, in the quiet hours after everyone had gone home, they lingered. One night, Naomi stood by the warehouse's massive window, looking out at the river where old factories cast long shadows across the water. Evan approached her quietly, his presence gentle, patient. "Do you ever think we're insane?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold. "Trying to compete with giants using a warehouse that smells like radiator smoke and old coffee? All revolutions begin with bad heating and good ideas," she murmured. He laughed softly, and the sound warmed her more than any space heater ever could. But then he grew quieter. "I never believed in anything the way I believe in this," he said, glancing at her, not at the window, not at the sketches on the wall, but at her. "Or the way I believe in you." The confession settled between them like falling snow, soft, fragile, impure. Naomi felt her pulse stir. She knew the dangers of mixing business and emotion, knew how fragile the foundation of a startup could be. Yet there was something undeniable in the way their lives had intertwined, something that made the risk feel not reckless, but right. "Evan," she began, unsure how to finish. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He simply waited, offering her the space to decide. And in that space, she realized something simple and profound. They weren't just building a company. They were building a future. One blueprint, one algorithm, one shared breath at a time. By spring, FlowLogic had moved out of the warehouse and into a modest office downtown. Investors were calling them back. Early pilot programs showed promise. Their team expanded. Their victories, though small, felt monumental. And through it all, Naomi and Evan worked side by side, two people bound by ambition, vision, and a growing affection they were both afraid to name aloud. But it didn't matter, because every time their fingers brushed while passing documents, every time their conversations drifted from analytics to dreams, every time Evan looked at Naomi with that quiet awe, it was clear they had already begun writing a love story neither of them dared to claim yet, but both were undeniably living. Success, when it arrived, did not come in a single triumphant sweep. It came like a rising tide, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere at once. By the end of their second year, FlowLogic had shifted from hopeful startup to rising star, whispered about in industry circles, and quietly studied by competing firms. Investors who once hesitated now asked for meetings. City planners invited them to conferences. Journalists requested interviews, and amid the swirl of growing recognition, Naomi and Evan found themselves tethered more tightly than ever. They worked late into the evenings in their new downtown office, a sleek, sunlight-drenched space overlooking the Detroit River. The world outside was changing, inching its way through recovery, but inside, the energy felt electric. FlowLogic's algorithms were beginning to shape real systems. Local pilot programs showed significant efficiency improvements. Their first city contracts trickled in. Yet success, like light through a prism, refracted everything it touched. At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible. Evan began receiving more invitations from venture boards, innovation councils, keynote panels. Naomi encouraged him. She knew the public face of the company mattered. And Evan, with his disarming charm and luminous optimism, embodied the kind of visionary the media adored. But with each passing week, his absences from the office stretched longer. Naomi would glance at the clock during strategy meetings and find his chair empty. Her phone buzzed more often with messages saying, "Running late, save me the notes." Or worse, "Go ahead without me." She told herself it was temporary. Growing pains, the natural evolution of a fast-scaling company. Still, something inside her tightened each time she presented alone, especially when she looked at the faces of their new investors, their gazes polite but assessing. And perhaps she wouldn't have noticed the shift so sharply if not for how rare their quiet moments together had become. There had once been evenings when they lingered over takeout containers, sharing stories of their childhoods or debating the ethics of urban automation. Nights when Evan fell asleep at his desk and Naomi carefully draped her coat over him, smiling at the way he mumbled half-formed ideas in his sleep. But those nights grew fewer. Instead, he returned to the office, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and unfamiliar colognes from crowded networking halls. He brought back glossy cards from venture fund managers who barely looked at Naomi during meetings, but shook Evan's hand with theatrical enthusiasm. "You're everywhere lately," she remarked one evening, trying to sound light. He flashed that familiar, bright smile. "You know how it is. People want to hear the big vision stuff. You're the brilliance behind it. I'm just the guy who talks with his hands." He meant it as a compliment. Naomi smiled back, but beneath her smile, a quiet worry began to form. It wasn't only the external demands that shifted. Something subtle in Evan shifted too. He had always been ambitious. She admired that about him. But success began to sharpen his edges. Decisions came faster, sometimes without consultation. He trusted intuition over analysis more than ever before. Ideas that once unfolded through long, collaborative discussions now appeared fully formed in meetings, passed off as inevitable. One Friday evening, Naomi found him in a glass-walled conference room with a group of new advisors, men in tailored suits who spoke in a chorus of confidence. She stood quietly outside the room, watching through the pane as Evan gestured animatedly toward projected revenue graphs, graphs she had built, refined, and stress-tested. But he didn't see her. And when the advisors shook hands and filed out, they barely acknowledged her at all. Evan finally noticed her waiting and grinned as though everything were perfectly normal. "Naomi, I was going to tell you about this. Just a bit of exploratory talk for a West Coast expansion. Nothing set in stone." "Exploratory?" she repeated softly. "This looks like more than that." He shrugged, brushing it off with ease. "They got excited. You know how these guys are." Yes, she thought. I know exactly how these guys are. She wanted to ask why she hadn't been included. She wanted to tell him that expansion without a solid infrastructure plan was reckless. But something in his expression, a fragile, almost defensive pride, stopped her. Instead, she said, "We'll need to revisit those projections if this is serious." Evan nodded, absently, already reaching for his buzzing phone. Once again, she watched him from a small distance, feeling the shift. Not a rupture, not yet, but a hairline fracture in the foundation they'd built together. At home, their life remained warm, but quieter. Dinners became rushed meals between meetings. Their once effortless banter grew sporadic, still lovely, still tender, but threaded with a faint strain. They found themselves collapsing into bed, exhausted, their touches lingering but brief. Some nights, Naomi lay awake beside him, listening to the soft rise and fall of his breathing, thinking of the early days when they whispered future plans into the dark. They used to feel like two halves of a single idea. Now she sometimes felt the distance in the space between them, small but real. Yet even as cracks emerged, she clung to the truth she knew. Evan loved her. He trusted her. And Flow Logic was their life's work, built with the sweat of their shared ambition and the tenderness of their shared love. But the world had begun to pull him outward, stretching him toward rooms designed for giants and visionaries and those who spoke the loudest. And Naomi, who had always valued depth over noise, found herself wondering whether success might carry a price neither of them had anticipated. As she closed her laptop late one night, the office empty around her, she traced her fingers over a whiteboard sketch of Flow Logic's earliest model, a diagram she and Evan had drawn together in the warehouse on their first winter. The memory made her chest ache. The dream they had built was rising higher than either of them imagined. But with altitude came turbulence, and the night whispered a truth she wasn't yet ready to face. Even the strongest structures could fracture from within. Autumn crept into Detroit with a kind of hushed elegance, brushing the skyline in copper and gold. Flow Logic's headquarters, now a polished glass structure on the riverfront, gleamed like a promise fulfilled. Inside, the hum of ambition filled every hallway. New hires arrived weekly, departments expanded, and the corridors that once echoed with only Naomi's and Evan's conversations now vibrated with the movement of dozens of eager minds. But with growth came change, and with change came the quiet rearrangement of roles, influence, and unseen loyalties. It began with a single meeting. Naomi returned from a regional conference to find the executive team assembled around the large oval table in the main boardroom. The atmosphere buzzed with unfamiliar anticipation. She slid into her seat beside Evan, who flashed her a distracted smile before turning back to his tablet. "We're waiting for someone," he murmured. Before she could ask who, the door opened, and in stepped a woman whose presence altered the air, subtle as shifting gravity. Dahlia Monroe. She was the type of woman who arrived without needing to announce herself, confident yet controlled, polished without a hint of artifice. Tall, poised, with the kind of beauty that came less from symmetry and more from self-possession. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek knot, and her monochrome suit gave her an almost sculptural silhouette. But it was her eyes that caught Naomi's attention. Clear, calculating, observant. Not cold, but penetrating. "Everyone," Evan said, rising with an enthusiasm that felt just a shade too bright. "This is Dahlia Monroe. She'll be joining us as Chief Legal Architect. Her work on regulatory frameworks and corporate compliance is some of the best I've seen." Dahlia extended her hand. "It's an honor. I've followed Flow Logic since its inception. What you built here is extraordinary." Her gaze landed briefly on Naomi, and for a moment Naomi felt seen in a way that was almost unsettling. Appraised, measured, quietly acknowledged. She shook Dahlia's hand. "Welcome. I'm glad to have you." And she meant it, or tried to, because even in that first moment, something in her instincts stirred, soft but undeniable, like the rustle of wings before a storm. Dahlia made herself indispensable with astonishing swiftness. Within weeks, she had untangled a backlog of regulatory paperwork, preempted several compliance risks, and crafted legal pathways Naomi hadn't considered. Her intellect was razor-sharp, her strategic mind impressive. Meetings that once required hours now flowed smoothly with her guidance. Evan was enthralled. "She's brilliant," he said one evening as they walked out of the office together. "We were drowning in bureaucracy before she came. She sees the big picture." Naomi nodded, forcing an appreciative smile. "She's certainly capable." Capable, yes, but also ambitious, quietly, subtly ambitious. Dahlia asked the right questions, anticipated Evan's concerns, mirrored his urgency and his appetite for bold moves. She pushed for rapid expansion. She challenged Naomi's caution with articulate precision, always politely, always rationally, but with an edge. And Naomi, who had once shaped every strategy, found herself increasingly nudged aside by a voice bold enough to match Evan's and sharp enough to earn his immediate confidence. The exclusion began in increments small enough to dismiss, until they weren't. One Thursday morning, Naomi opened the company calendar to find a new strategic meeting scheduled for that afternoon. She frowned. Expansion Framework Committee, a meeting she would normally lead. Yet her name wasn't listed. She assumed it was an oversight, until she walked past the glass conference room and saw them. Evan and Dahlia seated side by side, deep in discussion with three board advisors. Whiteboards filled with expansion routes, flow diagrams, risk matrices. Her risk matrices. She stood there for a moment, her breath caught between disbelief and a simmering ache. Evan glanced up and spotted her through the glass. His eyes widened, not with guilt, but with a kind of perplexed surprise, as if he had forgotten she should be there. He gestured for her to enter, but Naomi did not. She simply inclined her head, turned, and walked back to her office. Each step quieter than the last, each breath more carefully measured. That evening, when Evan finally emerged from the meeting, he found Naomi gathering her things. "Why didn't you come in?" he asked. Her voice was calm, practiced. "I wasn't invited." He blinked. "It wasn't like that. Dahlia put the meeting together last minute. I assumed she included you." Assumed. A single word, slicing quietly. Naomi closed her laptop gently. "If a meeting discusses our expansion strategy, Evan, I shouldn't need an invitation." He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's been chaotic. Dahlia's helping streamline things. She's—" "I know what she is," Naomi interrupted softly. "Brilliant, organized, efficient, present. All the things Naomi had been from the beginning, before the world started pulling him in 1,000 glittering directions." Evan reached for her hand, a gesture meant to soothe, but something in her shifted away instinctively, so slightly he almost didn't notice. Almost. His shoulders tensed. "Naomi," he said quietly, "you know I trust you. You're the backbone of this company." But the words tasted like a memory, sweet, familiar, and just a little stale. Over the next months, the shift deepened. Dahlia was always there, at Evan's side during pitches, reviewing contracts late into the evening, flying with him to meet stakeholders in Chicago, Denver, Seattle. She challenged his strategies and sharpened his decisions, helping him craft bolder, faster, riskier moves. And the more she aligned with him, the more Naomi felt herself unmoored. It wasn't jealousy of beauty or presence. It was the erosion of partnership. It was being slowly, systematically written out of the story she had co-authored. In meetings, Dahlia offered counterpoints before Naomi could speak. In strategy sessions, Evan turned to Dahlia first. In investor communications, her legal summaries overshadowed Naomi's financial insights. Little by little, Naomi's voice, once a foundation, became background noise. She tried to rationalize it. Teams evolve, roles shift, growth demands specialization. But deep down, she recognized the shape of what was happening. Evan was becoming the man she once feared he could be. Someone dazzled by momentum, pulled toward the loudest applause, drifting beyond the quiet strength that had built their beginnings. And Dahlia was becoming indispensable to him. Too indispensable. One evening, Naomi lingered outside the boardroom, gathering scattered documents after a long day. Through the half-closed blinds, she saw Evan and Dahlia standing close, reviewing a digital display. Their voices were low, their shoulders almost touching. Evan laughed softly at something Dahlia said, a laugh Naomi hadn't heard from him in weeks. The sight did not break her. It hollowed her, not with jealousy, but with an ancient, aching recognition. She was losing him, not to another woman, but to another version of himself. A version that did not seem to have space for her wisdom, her caution, her partnership, or her heart. And when she finally stepped into the cool night air, Detroit humming around her, Naomi whispered into the wind a truth she wasn't ready to accept. Success had come, and with it, the first sharp fracture in the life she had built with him. The heart rarely shatters in a single moment. Most of the time it unravels, thread by thread, memory by memory, until one day you look down and realize the fabric of your life is no longer what it was. For Naomi, the unraveling began in silence. It started in the spaces where Evan used to be. In the mornings, when he once pressed a sleepy kiss to her shoulder, before rolling out of bed to scribble ideas on the nearest notebook, she now woke to the cold imprint of where his body had been. The glow from his side of the City View apartment came not from his presence, but from the blinking light of his phone, left charging while he spent yet another night at late meetings, late flights, late urgent drinks with people whose names Naomi had stopped trying to remember. She told herself this was what growth demanded. She told herself this was temporary. But excuses, like glass, become thinner each time they're stretched. She noticed the first real tear on an evening that should have been joyful. FlowLogic had just secured its largest contract yet, an agreement with a consortium of Midwestern cities to implement their logistics platform across multiple regions. It was the kind of deal Naomi had dreamed of in the early days, proof that their work could reshape real infrastructure, touch real lives. The office was buzzing with quiet celebration. Someone popped sparkling cider. Someone else ordered a last-minute spread of food. Laughter spilled through the hallways. Naomi stood with a glass in hand, watching as Evan and Dahlia accepted congratulations side by side. The two of them looked, if she were honest, striking together. A unified front, charisma and precision, vision and strategy. The story wrote itself. Brilliant restructuring on the risk side, Dr. Carter, one of the senior engineers said, offering Naomi an earnest smile. We couldn't have landed this without your model updates. She thanked him, but the words slipped past like a breeze, unable to anchor. Across the room, an investor clapped Evan on the shoulder. You and Dahlia make quite the team, he said appreciatively. This contract has your fingerprints all over it. Naomi watched as Evan's gaze flickered, just briefly, toward her. There was something like apology in his eyes, but it was fleeting, washed away in the next wave of conversation. She didn't begrudge Dahlia her competence. That wasn't the wound. The wound was being rewritten in real time. From founding partner to background constant, from co-architect to reliable support. It was being present when the story of her work was retold, and hearing her own name fade to a footnote. That night at home, the city lights stretched in shimmering lines beyond their apartment windows. Naomi sat at the kitchen table with a cup of peppermint tea grown lukewarm, her fingers curved around the mug, as though warmth could be coaxed back into places that had grown cold. Evan came in late, his tie loosened, laughter still echoing faintly from some conversation that had continued past the office doors. You should have stayed, he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. We went out for a bit after the team thing. The mayor's chief of staff showed up. It turned into a whole thing. I'm sure it did, she said softly, her cheek barely tilting toward his lips. He straightened, sensing the shift. Hey, he murmured. What's wrong? The question was so familiar, so gently delivered, that for a moment their earlier years flashed between them. Long nights, whispered fears, the way he used to draw her into his arms when work weighed too heavily on her shoulders. But that was before she began to feel like she was standing on the outside of glass, watching him live a life that no longer required her presence. Naomi drew in a slow breath. Do you remember the first financial model we built together? She asked. He smiled faintly. The one we drew on that piece of cardboard in the warehouse? Yes, she said. You called it our roadmap to impossible. You still have that, he said, warmth touching his voice. You kept it pinned above your desk for years. I still do, she replied. Sometimes I look at it and wonder when our turned into your and. He frowned. What do you mean? Your and whoever is in the room with you, she said quietly. Your and the investors. Your and the board. Your and Dahlia. The name hung in the air like a fragile, crystalline thing. Evan exhaled. Naomi, this again. It's not jealousy, she interrupted gently. I don't resent her for doing her job well. I resent that I am being asked to watch the story of what we built be rewritten as if I were just support staff you outgrew. His jaw tightened. No one is rewriting anything. You're overthinking this. Overthinking. How many times had the world used that word to make a woman doubt the clarity of her intuition? Naomi's fingers loosened around the mug. I'm not overthinking, she said. I'm watching. There's a difference. Silence spread between them, heavy and thick. Evan leaned back, frustration and fatigue flickering across his face. I can't keep reassuring you after every meeting, he said. We're in a different phase now. The company needs different things. I need different things to keep this moving. The words weren't shouted, but they landed like blows all the same. Different thing. The phrase echoed in her chest, lodging somewhere beneath her ribs. And what do you need now? She asked, voice steady despite the trembling within. What you did not find in the woman who built this with you? In the partner who protected us from folding a dozen times? His eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, she saw not confusion or guilt, but something harder. Defensiveness, almost irritation, like a man who sees himself as cornered rather than questioned. I need to move forward, he said, without every decision turning into an interrogation. There it was. Naomi swallowed, the taste of unshed tears burning her throat. I thought we were interrogating the future together, she whispered, not each other. He didn't answer. The silence that followed did not feel like an argument. It felt like distance made visible, like the quiet stretch of road between two cars that once traveled side by side, now drifting into separate lanes. In the days that followed, Naomi's composure became both armor and prison. She performed flawlessly. She attended every meeting she was invited to, and some she invited herself into. She updated models, advised teams, mentored younger staff. She moved through the office like the steady axis around which things still spun, even as the spotlight swung further away. But inside, the unraveling continued. She woke with a weight in her chest she could not name. She found herself staring longer at old photos, grainy shots of her and Evan in the warehouse, cheeks smudged with marker ink, shining with laughter. She listened to the woman in those photos, heard the hope in her unguarded smile, and felt both tenderness and grief for her. There were moments she wanted to run, back to academia, to policy, to a quieter life where her worth was not measured in how loudly someone else spoke over her. Yet every time she stood near a city view, watching the movement of trucks, trains, ships, she remembered why she had stayed. Cities still needed what she had built. People still needed systems that didn't fail the ones already on the margins. It wasn't flow logic she no longer trusted. It was the man she had once believed would never wield power in a way that diminished her. Late one night, alone in her office, she opened an old folder on her laptop, one she rarely touched. Inside were early drafts of FlowLogic's concept notes, labeled with Carter Whitaker in the header. She stared at their names side by side. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she highlighted one of the files and duplicated it into a new folder. This time she labeled it simply Carter, Independent Models. It was a subtle act. No press release, no declaration. But in that moment, she began quietly gathering herself back from the places she had given away too freely. The heart might unravel in threads, but it can also learn to weave itself anew. The day the truth arrived wore the disguise of ordinary. The sky above Neo-San Francisco was a soft, faded blue, the kind that promised neither storm nor brilliance, just a steady, unremarkable calm. Naomi had risen before dawn for a round table with regional planners, dressing in a charcoal suit that made her feel, as always, composed and prepared. She delivered her presentation with quiet authority, speaking of infrastructure equity and adaptive logistics as if she weren't carrying a small, persistent ache beneath her ribs. By mid-morning, the meeting ended ahead of schedule. You've given us more than enough to think about, the chair had said warmly. Get some rest, Dr. Carter. You've earned it. Rest, she thought wryly, stepping into the waiting car, as if rest were something one simply chose. The driver offered to take her to the office, but for once she shook her head. Home, she murmured. Please. Maybe, she told herself, she could steal a rare hour of silence. Sit by the window, let the city hum beneath her while she sorted through the tangle of her own thoughts. When the elevator doors slid open onto their penthouse floor, the hallway was unusually quiet. No low music drifting under the door, no muffled voice calls from Evan's endless meetings. She slipped her key card into the lock, waited for the soft chime, and stepped inside. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The apartment was bathed in late morning light, pale and gentle. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glinting city below. A mug sat on the kitchen counter, a trace of coffee still clinging to the porcelain. One of Evan's jackets hung carelessly over the back of a chair. And yet, Naomi's instincts sharpened, tuning to something almost inaudible, a wrongness in the air, as if a piece of music were being played just half a measure off. Then she heard it, the faint rustle of paper, the click of a briefcase latch. From the den, her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. "Evan," she called, voice steady. There was a pause. Then, "Naomi." She walked toward the den, each footstep sinking into the quiet like stones dropped into still water. When she reached the doorway, she stopped. He stood beside the oak desk they had chosen together years ago, the one where they'd once sketched models and scribbled notes in the thick of midnight planning. Now it was littered with folders, thick, neatly stacked, some already tucked into an open leather briefcase. Personal account summaries, property deeds, equity documents. The files were too familiar, too telling. Evan froze for a heartbeat, then closed the briefcase with measured care, as if he could control the sound, soften the implication. "You're home early," he said, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought the planning session went all day." It finished ahead of schedule. Her gaze drifted to the papers, lingering there. "What are you doing?" He cleared his throat, adopting a tone that tried, and failed, to sound casual. "Just organizing some things for a meeting, estate planning. It's nothing dramatic." Naomi's mind flicked through the last few weeks. Every late night, every unexplained absence, every urgent conversation with advisors she was never invited to join. "You're meeting with Harper?" she asked, naming their longtime estate attorney. "I spoke to his office yesterday. His assistant said he was out of town until next week." The silence that followed was not loud. It was delicate, brittle, like glass about to break. Evan exhaled, the facade dropping from his shoulders like a coat he could no longer bear to wear. "Naomi," he began, and this time there was some rawness in his voice. "We need to talk." The phrase was cliché, but the weight in it wasn't. She leaned against the doorframe, willing her body to remain still, her mind to stay clear. "Then talk," she said quietly. He looked at her, not the way he used to, with shared excitement or familiar affection, but as a man bracing himself before delivering a verdict. "This isn't working anymore," he said. "The marriage, the partnership, we've grown in different directions." The sentence landed with the muted finality of a gavel. Naomi felt something inside her tighten, then loosen, as if a rope that had been pulled for years had finally snapped. "Different directions," she repeated, her tone almost reflective. "Is that what we're calling it?" He shifted, fingers tightening on the briefcase handle. "You know, things have been strained. We disagree on almost everything now. Strategy, risk, pace. I can't keep feeling like I'm fighting a war on two fronts, out there and in here." She swallowed, her pulse steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Disagreement isn't war, Evan. It's balance. It always has been." "Maybe once," he said, "but not anymore. You're always questioning, always slowing things down. I need someone who believes in where I'm going, not someone who keeps dragging me back to where we've been." The words were cruel, only in how honest they were. Naomi took a breath, letting the truth settle. "And is that what she does?" He blinked. Who? She held his gaze. Dahlia. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then calculation, then a flicker of guilt so small he almost smothered it before it surfaced. This isn't about Dahlia, he said. Yes, Naomi replied softly. It is. They stood there, the air thick with unsaid details. Naomi did not need confessions. She had always read patterns more clearly than words. The late nights, the quiet laughter she heard when he thought she was asleep, the way their names, once naturally paired, now existed in different sentences, different rooms, different futures. Tell me one truth, she said. Did you start planning this, our separation, before you ever told me something was wrong? He looked away. Evan. Yes, he admitted finally. I started talking to the lawyers a few months ago. I needed to understand the cleanest way to divide things. For both of us. For both of us. The phrase twisted inside her. So you drafted an exit strategy, she murmured. For the marriage, for the company. And you made sure you could step out of both without destabilizing your position. Naomi, you'll be more than taken care of, he said quickly, as if generosity could soften betrayal. The settlement is fair. You'll have financial security for life. No one is trying to erase what you contributed. A bitter, quiet sort of humor curved her lips. Financial security, she echoed, as if that has ever been what I've wanted from you. He frowned, frustration surfacing. What do you want from me then? For this to be ugly? For us to destroy everything we built just to make a point? Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. She would not let them. Not now. Not for this. What I wanted, Naomi said slowly, was honesty before you turned our life into a problem to be solved in private. I wanted to be your partner, even in the ending, not your liability. The word hung there. Liability. And something in Evan's expression hardened, as though he felt accused of a crime he'd already justified to himself. You're not a liability, he said. You're risk-averse. And that's not what this next phase needs. It was a clean incision, precise and practiced. The kind of language he used in boardrooms that had never learned the vocabulary of love. Naomi straightened, pressing her back gently against the doorframe, anchoring herself. So what happens now? She asked. He cleared his throat. The papers will be sent over later today. My lawyers will contact yours. We can decide how to communicate this to the board. To the press. I'd like to keep things civil. Civil. She looked at the briefcase, at the files, at the man she had once believed would never turn her life into a transaction. Then she met his eyes one last time, and for a moment she saw again the boy in the Detroit cafe, all hope and spark and dazzling possibility. The contrast between then and now made her chest feel hollow. I won't stand in your way, she said quietly. You've already done far too much planning for that. His shoulders sagged with what might have been relief. This is for the best, Naomi, for both of us. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she needed him to leave before the weight of this moment crushed what little remained of her composure. Go, she said gently. You've clearly rehearsed your exit. Don't let me delay it. He flinched, just slightly. Then, without another word, he picked up the briefcase and walked past her, the scent of his cologne trailing behind like a ghost. The den fell quiet. The whole apartment fell quiet. Naomi stood alone in the doorway, the echo of his departure settling into the corners of the room. For a long time she did not move. She simply listened to the hum of the city, the faint ticking of the clock, the slow, unfamiliar sound of a heart beginning to break in earnest. Then, at last, she walked to the desk. She laid her hand on the polished wood, remembering the heat of his fingers beside hers years before, the way their laughter once filled this space. And in that same place, surrounded now by empty folders and the shadow of decisions made without her, Naomi whispered, not to him, not even to the past, but to herself. This is not the end of my story. Her voice trembled, but it did not falter. Because somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the shock and the sharp sting of betrayal, something else stirred. a quiet, steady ember of resolve, waiting for its turn to burn. The first night after Evan left, the apartment forgot how to be a home. It remembered how to be beautiful. The city lights still spilled across the floor in soft, shimmering patterns. The furniture still sat in tasteful arrangement. The bedroom still held the faint scent of cedar and jasmine. But the warmth that had once filled the spaces between those details was gone, as if someone had opened a hidden door and let it all escape. Naomi sat on the edge of their bed long after midnight, still wearing the blouse and slacks she'd put on for the morning's meeting, as though changing into something softer would require admitting the day had truly happened. The divorce papers lay on the nightstand, a heavy, pristine envelope, too white, too clean. She did not touch it. She stared instead at the skyline beyond the glass, the veins of light threading through Neo-San Francisco, the soft drift of autonomous vehicles gliding along elevated routes she had once helped design. Down there, her mind whispered, somewhere, FlowLogic's algorithms were humming, balancing loads, predicting demands, orchestrating motion. Up here, everything was still. The first tear came without warning, slipping over the edge of her lower lashes with a quiet, almost apologetic descent. Then another, and another. Naomi folded in on herself, arms wrapping around her ribcage, as if she could hold herself together by force alone. The sound that escaped her was not loud. It was low, raw, a kind of mourning that had no words, only the ache of someone grieving not a single loss, but many layered ones. The man she loved, the partner she trusted, the future she believed in, the version of herself who had built a life around that belief. She cried for the girl in Detroit who had said yes to a dream in a cafe. She cried for the woman who had spent nights bent over projections, protecting them both from collapse. She cried for the part of her that had stayed loyal, even as she felt herself being edged out of her own story. And when there were no tears left, only hoarseness and a pulsing ache behind her eyes, she lay back on the bed they had once shared and stared at the ceiling, feeling the hollow stretch of the space beside her like an accusation. It would have been easy, in that moment, to believe the cruel narrative the situation suggested, that she had been left behind, that she was no longer necessary, that her caution, her integrity, her insistence on balance were flaws in a world that rewarded those who ran hardest toward the edge. A part of her wanted to sink into that story, to let it define her, to surrender to the quiet erosion of self that comes with heartbreak. But grief, in her, met something else, something older, something forged long before Evan Whitaker ever walked into her life. By morning, exhaustion had wrapped itself around her like a second skin. She moved through the apartment on instinct, shower, coffee, a change of clothes, ignoring the envelope that waited like a silent spectator on the nightstand. She almost left it there. Almost. At the door, keys in hand, laptop bag over her shoulder, she paused. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she returned to the bedroom. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Legal weight, legal ink, legal consequence. Her name printed beside his on the front. Naomi Elise Carter Whitaker. She stared at the hyphen for a long time. Then she slipped a finger beneath the seal and opened it. The language inside was precise, clinical, absently generous. Evan's attorneys had crafted a settlement that, to any outside eye, would seem more than fair. A substantial financial package, shared property arranged into neat columns of his and hers, structured payouts that promise comfort and stability. Comfort, stability. As if those were the currencies she had built her life around. Naomi read every line, the way she would read a contract for any other deal. At first her vision blurred, not with tears this time, but with rising disbelief. There were sections devoted to stock distributions and post-divorce communication protocols. There were notes about public relations strategies and non-disparagement clauses. But there was almost nothing meaningful about FlowLogic's foundational architecture, about her intellectual contributions, about the technology she had shaped with the same care someone might use sculpting bone. It was as if the papers assumed her role had always been adjacent, supportive, graciously rewarded, but ultimately interchangeable. It was, in every sense, a tidy erasure. Naomi set the papers down, her fingertips tingling, not with fear, but with something clear and electric. So this is how he saw me, she thought, as someone to be smoothed out of the picture, a problem to be resolved politely. She moved to the den, to the shelves where she kept her personal archives, labeled binders, external drives, meticulously organized folders, years of work, of research, of models she had developed long before FlowLogic had a name, long before Evan had a pitch. She pulled down one binder, then another. Inside were early algorithm drafts in her handwriting, city flow simulations she had run while still at the Fed, emails from their first months of building together, threads where she had sent him frameworks, proposed refinements, highlighted risks he hadn't seen. She skimmed one of them. If we integrate adaptive demand curves into the routing system, we can avoid overloading specific neighborhoods and reduce delivery inequities. His reply from years ago glowed on the screen. You're unreal, Naomi. This whole thing works because of how your brain sees the city. She felt no satisfaction in the validation, only clarity. She had proof of what she already knew. She wasn't some benevolent spouse who had simply cheered from the sidelines. She was co-architect, co-creator, co-founder in every way that mattered, whether the paperwork reflected it or not. Evan had forgotten that. The legal documents pretended not to know it at all. But the truth was here, written in code, ink, and the memories of early employees who had watched her build. Naomi straightened, a slow, deliberate motion. The exhaustion was still there, but beneath it something solid was forming, a core of resolve, dense and unyielding. If he saw her as a liability to be paid off and quietly moved aside, then he had miscalculated. Terribly, that afternoon she did something she had postponed ever since their wedding. She found the slim leather address book tucked in the back of her desk drawer and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Naomi, the voice on the other end was warm, faintly surprised. It's been a long time. Hi, Marisol, Naomi said, and for the first time since the previous day, her voice felt like it belonged to her. I think I'm in need of a very good divorce attorney. There was a pause, and then a firm, unhesitating reply. Then you called the right woman. Tell me everything. Naomi told her, not with drama, but with the crisp efficiency of someone who had done her own emotional work already. She laid out the situation, the years of collaboration, the growing exclusions, the exit strategy planned in secret, the settlement papers that valued comfort over recognition. When she finished, Marisol was quiet for a moment. What do you want? Her friend asked. Not what they're offering. What do you actually want? Naomi looked out the window at the city pulsing with the systems she understood so intimately. I want what I've earned, she said. Not just money, recognition, acknowledgement of my role in the technology and the company we built, and the freedom to build something that is mine, not an afterthought, not a consolation prize. And him? Marisol asked softly. Naomi's chest tightened. She thought of Evan's laugh, his spark, the years when they had felt like two minds moving in perfect tandem. He made his choices, she said at last. I can't unmake them for him, but I won't let those choices define the rest of my life. Good, Marisol replied. Then let's make sure this settlement reflects that. I'll assemble a team. This won't be quick or simple. I know, Naomi said. I'm done with simple. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment, the hush of the apartment surrounding her. It still didn't feel like a home. Not yet. But for the first time since the envelope arrived, it didn't feel like a mausoleum either. It felt like what it was, a threshold. Naomi walked back to the bedroom. The divorce papers still lay on the nightstand, waiting for a signature that would not come. Not like this. She picked up a pen, uncapped it, and in the margin of the first page, beside her printed name, she wrote a single word in neat, deliberate script, contested. Then she set the pen down and drew a slow breath, feeling the shape of herself settle, stronger and clearer, inside her chest. Collapse had come, as it always does when something you believed unshakable falls apart. But from beneath the wreckage, something else was rising. Not vengeance, not bitterness, but a fierce, luminous resolve. Naomi Carter had been many things in the story so far. Partner, strategist, wife. It was time for her to become something more formidable, the author of her own next chapter. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, suspended clarity. Like the world had slowed its rotation just enough for Naomi to see every angle, every shift in the light, every contour of the path she had to walk. She moved quietly, deliberately, not like someone hiding, but like someone preparing. From the outside, she still appeared composed, impeccably dressed, steady-voiced, calm in meetings, offering sharp insights with the same elegance she always had. But beneath the surface, her mind was mapping possibilities the way it once mapped logistics networks, identifying vulnerabilities, strengths, opportunities, and fault lines. This time, the system she was analyzing was not a city. It was a man, a company, a narrative that had taken her name and diminished it to an afterthought. No longer. Her first meeting with Marisol and the legal team took place in a high-rise office overlooking the bay. Sunlight struck the conference table in clean, diagonal streaks, illuminating the stacks of binders Naomi had brought from her archives. Handwritten notes, early models, emails, algorithm drafts, patent sketches in her handwriting. "These are your receipts," Marisol murmured, her eyes widening slightly as she flipped through the documents. Evan's attorneys will try to argue technical contribution versus conceptual contribution. But these, she tapped Naomi's original algorithmic sketches. "These are indisputable." Naomi nodded. "He always said the company worked because we balanced each other, that his vision needed structure." A short, controlled breath. "What he didn't anticipate is that I kept everything." Marisol smiled, not triumphantly, but with a kind of resolute admiration. "Then we build your case from the truth he hoped would stay hidden." They spent hours outlining the strategy. Recognize Naomi as co-creator of FlowLogic's foundational predictive engine. Challenge the narrative of Evan as sole innovator. Expose the timeline of decisions made behind closed doors. Reveal the intellectual property that bore her hand long before the company had legal frameworks in place. "This will take time," Marisol warned gently, "and it may get ugly." Naomi simply said, "I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm afraid of erasure." The next step required something far more difficult, facing the people who knew her story, respected it, and yet had slowly forgotten the extent of her fingerprints on the company's origin. She scheduled a private dinner with 3 of FlowLogic's first employees, engineers who had been with them back in the warehouse days when equipment malfunctioned and late-night brainstorming sessions were interrupted by the sound of freight trains rumbling along the river. They met at a quiet rooftop restaurant, the air scented with basil and drifting sea breeze. Naomi, one of them, Tariq, studied her face with concern. "Is everything okay?" She didn't lie. "No," she said softly, "but it will be." She told them what had happened, not the intimate details of her heartbreak, but the professional betrayal. How her work had been minimized, how the settlement documents implied she had played a supporting role rather than a foundational one. Tariq set down his glass slowly, his brow furrowing. "That's not true," he said with quiet conviction. "We all know the routing engine was yours. Evan talked big, but you built the bones." The others nodded. "Whatever you need," said Janelle, her voice steady. "First-hand accounts, testimony, internal emails. Will come forward." The lump that rose in Naomi's throat was soft, warm, relief tinged with something close to gratitude. These were the people who had seen her at 2 a.m., hair tied back, sleeves rolled, sketching algorithms on scrap paper while Evan pitched ideals into the air. They remembered the truth because they had lived it beside her. Naomi felt the strength of that circle forming around her like armor. Her third move was strategic, quiet, and measured. She filed a preliminary disclosure with the Federal Commerce Registry, a document detailing her contributions to FlowLogic's base algorithms and early intellectual property. It was not a lawsuit, merely a filing, but it triggered automatic notifications to FlowLogic's legal department. Dahlia would see it. Evan would have to read it. The disclosure was thorough, without revealing her full arsenal. Dates of algorithm development. Attached original notes. Early prototype simulations she ran. Emails demonstrating her conceptual authorship. It was beautifully precise, undeniably hers. When she submitted it electronically, she felt a subtle shift inside her. A small, satisfying click, like a mechanism falling into place. She wasn't just defending herself, she was reclaiming truth. 2 days later, nearly the entire city buzzed about the filing. Industry analysts debated the implications. Investors speculated quietly. FlowLogic's board convened an emergency call behind closed doors. Evan canceled 3 public appearances, and Dahlia requested a meeting. The message arrived in Naomi's inbox, cool and professional. Dr. Carter, I believe it would be in both our interests to discuss the recent disclosure. Sincerely, Dahlia Monroe, Chief Legal Architect, FlowLogic. Naomi read the email without emotion. The time when Dahlia stirred jealousy or resentment had passed. Now she saw Dahlia for what she was, a sharp strategist who had aligned herself with Evan's rise, but who also knew the fragility of a narrative built on omissions. She replied with equal poise, Ms. Monroe, I'm available tomorrow at 3 p.m. Regards, Dr. Naomi Carter. The meeting took place in a glass conference room at a downtown neutral site. Dahlia arrived precisely on time, her expression composed, her posture straight, a study in control. Thank you for meeting, Dahlia began, setting down her briefcase. I assume you've read the disclosure, Naomi replied, her voice steady and soft. I have, Dahlia said. It raises significant questions. No, Naomi corrected. It answers them. A beat of silence passed between them. Charged, but not hostile. Dahlia exhaled slowly. Evan didn't anticipate this. That, Naomi said gently, is evident. What is your intention, Naomi? Dahlia asked quietly. To force a claim? To pursue equity? To dismantle FlowLogic's foundation? Naomi held her gaze. My intention is to be written back into the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. Dahlia studied her for a long moment. Something softened in her eyes. Not sympathy, but respect. I underestimated you, Dahlia said finally. I think Evan did too. Naomi offered a small, steady smile. Many people mistake grace for passivity. It's an old, predictable miscalculation. Dahlia nodded once, accepting the point like a chess player conceding a well-earned move. I'll advise him to renegotiate. Naomi inclined her head. That would be wise. Her fourth and final move that week was personal, not procedural. She returned to the old warehouse, their first office, now owned by a robotics startup. The new tenants let her walk through after hours, the space echoing with unfamiliar equipment and new voices. But beneath the renovations, she still heard the echoes of her past. Her laughter, her arguments with Evan about risk curves, the soft scratch of marker on whiteboard, the clatter of takeout boxes, the heartbeat of a dream being built. She stood in the center of the old floor, hands tucked into her coat pockets, and let memory wash over her. Not with sorrow, but with clarity. This was where she had first learned the depth of her own ambition, where she had once mistaken partnership for permanence, where she had given freely, never imagining she would someday have to reclaim what was rightfully hers. And now she knew she could build again, not with him, not beside him, but beyond him. When Naomi left the warehouse and stepped into the cool evening air, the city felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, but aligned, as though a new map had unfolded inside her. She was not finished fighting. She was not close to done, because the legal battle was only the opening movement. The strategic counterstrike had only begun. And the woman walking home under the steel blue sky was no longer the wife grieving a betrayal. She was the architect of a reckoning. Atlanta smelled like possibility. It wasn't the polished, ornamental kind Naomi had grown used to in Neo-San Francisco. It was warmer, earthier, humming with a pulse that felt grounded rather than feverish. The air tasted of magnolia in the mornings and distant rainfall in the afternoons. Streetcars whispered along their tracks, and murals blossomed on brick walls like declarations of resilience. It was here, in the beating heart of a city that had rewritten itself many times, that Naomi chose to begin again. She stepped out of the old warehouse she had just signed the lease for, a cavernous red brick structure in the historic West End, its windows tall and arched, its bones sturdy from decades of reinvention. A place that had survived industrial collapse, cultural rebirth, and waves of innovation. A place, she sensed, that understood what it meant to rebuild with dignity. A perfect home for Carter Dynamics. Not a company born from wounded pride. Not a rebound project meant to mirror flow logic. But something truer, deeper, entirely hers. The first morning she unlocked the doors, the building greeted her with a chorus of sunbeams spilling through dust-flecked air. Naomi slid her hand across the rough wooden table she had salvaged from a local market, its imperfections a quiet testament to history. She set down her laptop, her notebook, and a bouquet of white lilies, her mother's favorite, on the makeshift desk. Then she stood still. She let the silence of the empty warehouse wrap around her. Let it touch the places inside her that still felt bruised. Let it whisper something she had not allowed herself to believe in weeks. You are not starting over, you are starting forward. Naomi inhaled deeply, and for the first time since her world fractured, she felt whole. The early days of Carter Dynamics were nothing like FlowLogic's beginnings. There were no frantic midnight modeling sessions, no chaotic wiring of servers, no improvisations born of youthful urgency. Instead, there was intention, thoughtfulness, a slower, steadier rhythm that matched the way Naomi now lived inside her own skin. She recruited carefully, seeking out the brilliant minds who had been overlooked in larger corporations, people who thrived in collaboration rather than competition, engineers from historically black colleges and universities with a keen understanding of urban systems, designers who preferred human-centered approaches over flashy innovation, economists who understood that data wasn't abstract, it was shaped by real people's lives. She offered flexible schedules, transparent pay structures, mental health stipends, community engagement hours. She insisted that meetings begin with listening, not assertion, and she built her leadership around a simple principle. A company should never sacrifice humanity in the name of progress. It was the antithesis of the environment she had left behind, and the very thing that made Carter Dynamics magnetic. Within months, they had partnerships with local universities, city planners, and grassroots organizations. They weren't chasing billion-dollar valuations. They were pursuing meaningful transformation, infrastructure that prioritized underserved neighborhoods, logistics that eased burdens instead of shifting them, data models that asked not just, can this be optimized, but who benefits, who doesn't, and why? Naomi found herself waking before dawn with excitement rather than dread. She spent evenings sketching ideas at her kitchen table, surrounded by jazz music and the soft hum of cicadas through the open window. She rediscovered joy in small things: morning tea steeped perfectly, the scent of fresh paint in the office, the laughter of her young engineers as they argued about code and poetry in equal measure. She felt alive, more alive than she had in years. Yet even as she built this new chapter, the legal battles with FlowLogic surged publicly. Reporters speculated, investors whispered, industry forums brimmed with debates. Who truly built the backbone of FlowLogic's technology? Was the company at risk of losing its IP? Was Naomi a visionary wronged, or a spurned genius striking back? Naomi ignored the noise. She didn't offer dramatic interviews. She didn't sling accusations or drip venom into public discourse. Her silence, her refusal to engage in spectacle, became its own kind of power. Instead, she focused on her work. Each contract Carter Dynamics secured was a message. Each partnership was a sentence. Each innovation was a paragraph. Together, they wrote a story louder than any headline. She didn't need vindication from the past. She was building her future in full daylight. The moment she realized she had truly transformed was startling in its simplicity. One humid afternoon, Naomi stood with her team beneath the exposed beams of the warehouse, reviewing a city pilot program they'd launched in Atlanta's South Side, an initiative that used predictive logistics to eliminate food desert zones. She watched as her engineers presented results, their faces glowing with pride. She saw the way her strategists referenced her frameworks with natural reverence. She listened to plans for expansion, shared goals, dreams spoken bravely and without hesitation. Then one of her interns, a young woman barely 20, with bright eyes and braided hair that swung when she talked, looked at Naomi as if she were a living constellation. "Dr. Carter," she said shyly, "you inspire us. You make me believe there's space for people like me to change the world." Naomi's breath caught. It wasn't praise. It wasn't validation. It was legacy. And it was real. She smiled. Not the polished CEO smile she'd mastered at FlowLogic, but something softer, deeper, born from gratitude. "Thank you," Naomi said gently. "It means everything to hear that." The girl beamed. And in that moment, surrounded by people who saw her fully, not as an accessory to someone else's vision, but as a leader of her own, Naomi realized something with crystalline clarity. She had not been discarded. She had been unbound. Late that evening, after her team left, Naomi stepped outside into the warm Georgia twilight. The cicadas sang. Fireflies flickered above the grass like tiny lanterns. She stood alone beneath a sky streaked in lavender and peach, feeling the weight of her journey and the lightness of what lay ahead. Her world had collapsed. Her heart had been pierced. Her name had been nearly erased. And yet, here she was, standing in a new city, in her own company, under a sky vast enough to hold all that she had endured and all she was still becoming. She inhaled, exhaled, and whispered into the dusk, "I am not defined by what I lost. I'm defined by what I rise to build." The evening breeze wrapped around her, gentle and affirming. Naomi Carter, reclaimed, reborn, turned toward the warehouse lights behind her, ready to keep building the kind of future no one could take from her again. The first fractures in FlowLogic's facade were small enough that most people didn't see them. They appeared as delays no one could explain, slight mismatches between projected gains and actual returns. A pilot program in a Midwestern corridor that quietly underperformed, then underperformed again. At first, the board wrote them off as growing pains. The markets, enamored with Evan's charisma, barely blinked. But the system Naomi once helped to steady now moved without its ballast. And the absence of balance, like hairline cracks in tempered glass, began to spread. From Atlanta, Naomi watched the changes the way a careful reader watches the margins of a story, seeing notes others miss. She had not sought news of FlowLogic. It arrived on her doorstep anyway, through industry briefings, forwarded articles, hushed conversations at conferences. FlowLogic announces aggressive European expansion. Whitaker bets big on high-risk acquisitions. Analysts question sustainability of new strategy. It was all achingly familiar. Evan had always loved the romance of the leap more than the discipline of the landing. In the early days, she had run alongside him, weaving nets beneath his jumps. Now from a distance, she saw him jumping higher, faster, without anyone at his side to calculate the fall. One evening, after her team had left, and the Carter Dynamics office was quiet, Naomi sat at her desk in the Atlanta warehouse, a tablet glowing in the dim light. An article filled the screen, a long-form profile on FlowLogic's new phase. There he was, photographed against sleek glass in city glow. Evan looked every bit the visionary the world had crowned him to be. Jaw set, tie perfect, eyes bright with determination, and something more brittle beneath. The journalist praised his boldness, his appetite for disruption, his refusal to settle for incremental progress. Dahlia was quoted, precise and poised, describing their legal maneuvers and regulatory strategies with a confidence Naomi recognized. Yet just beneath the flattering headline, words of caution threaded through the piece. High leverage, compressed timelines, unrealistic synergy assumptions. Naomi read them with the quiet knowing of someone who had once redlined these very tendencies in red pen. Her heart did not leap in satisfaction. It ached, not for the empire he had chosen over her, for the wasted possibility of what they might have continued to build, if he had valued balance as deeply as he valued applause. She closed the article and turned off the tablet. Somewhere, far away, flow logic hurtled forward like a train whose brakes had been disconnected. And she, standing on a different platform now, could do nothing but watch the approaching curve. The descent did not happen all at once. First came the European rollout failure. It began with a glitch in an urban hub. Then 3. The predictive engine, now built upon layers of hurried modifications, misjudged demand spikes. Trucks idled where they should have moved. Docks went quiet where they should have been alive. Clients grew impatient, then angry. Whitaker called it a temporary calibration issue on a televised interview, smiling with the old confidence. Investors nodded, uneasy but unwilling to flinch. Then came the Asian partnership debacle. A rushed acquisition of a logistics startup in Singapore, championed by Evan and defended by Dahlia, turned sour when previously unknown liabilities surfaced. Regulatory fines mounted. Political relationships frayed. The board began to murmur in closed rooms. Inside Flow Logic, people whispered in hallways about overnight pivots, overnight layoffs, overnight memos signed without consultation. The place that once felt like a shared experiment began to feel like a kingdom bracing for siege. And beneath it all, the legal dispute between Flow Logic and Naomi over intellectual property sat simmering, quiet, unresolved, potent. A reminder in every investor's report that the very bedrock of the company's technology was not as cleanly owned as Evan had insisted. News of the first major crack broke on a rainy Thursday. Naomi was in a meeting with her team, reviewing the expansion of their food access initiative to a second Atlanta district, when her phone buzzed with insistent notifications. A flurry of alerts, screens lighting up at once. She silenced the device without glancing down. Her focus remained on the presentation in front of her. Only when the meeting ended and her team dispersed did she check the messages. A headline sat at the top of her news app. Flow Logic misses earnings expectations by historic margin. Stock plummets 18%. She stared at it without moving, her heart caught in an old reflex. She tapped the article. Slumping contracts, failed integrations, unanticipated write-downs on recent acquisitions, quotes from jittery analysts, an unusually subdued statement from Evan, citing temporary turbulence and short-term volatility in pursuit of long-term vision. In the comments, industry insiders were less polite. They scaled too fast, too many markets at once. No one questions him inside that company anymore. Naomi set the phone down and walked toward the warehouse's tall windows. Outside, the Atlanta sky was thick with clouds, but the city moved with an easy steadiness below. Buses glided along their routes. Delivery vans turned corners. People walked home beneath umbrellas, unbothered by market swings. Her reflection hovered faintly on the glass. For a moment, she saw another version of herself superimposed there. The Naomi who might have been standing beside Evan in Neo-San Francisco right now, justifying numbers, smoothing investors, swallowing her own misgivings for the sake of unity. That Naomi would have been exhausted, torn, haunted by the knowledge that she'd seen this coming and hadn't been able to stop it. The Naomi standing in Atlanta felt something else. Not triumph, not pity, a deep, bittersweet clarity. Some collapses, she knew, were not punishments. They were consequences. The spiral accelerated. Within weeks, internal emails leaked to the press. Former employees spoke off the record about a culture of urgency that had devoured deliberation, about a CEO who no longer listened, about legal gambles taken with more bravado than prudence. A second earnings miss followed, then a class action lawsuit from a group of European partners, then a formal probe into accounting irregularities tied to two of Evan's most aggressive acquisitions, the same business segments he'd expanded into after sidelining Naomi. Carter Dynamics names surfaced occasionally in the commentary, but only at the edges. Analysts comparing Naomi's measured growth to Evan's volatility, reporters noting the irony without pressing it into spectacle. She refused all invitations to comment. Her silence became its own quiet sentence. I told you who I was. I no longer owe you explanations. At night, when the world had quieted and only the distant hum of the city remained, Naomi allowed herself honest reflection. She remembered board meetings years ago when she'd raised concerns about over-leveraging, about expanding into unfamiliar regulatory environments without sufficient groundwork. Evan had smiled then, brushed her concerns aside with affectionate bravado. You see storms everywhere, he teased. Let me have my sun for once. Now the sun was burning him, and she, who had once stood between him and the worst of his impulses, was no longer there to shield him from himself. One evening, as summer stretched lazily over Atlanta, Naomi received a message from an unfamiliar number. Naomi, I don't know if you'll read this. I'm not even sure if I deserve for you to. But you should know, the board is in chaos. Investors are pushing for leadership changes. The company is not what it was. He is not what he was. For what it's worth, you were right. Dahlia. Naomi sat with the message for a long time, watching the words and the spaces between them. She did not reply. Not from cruelty, from understanding. Some realizations a person had to sit with alone. She stepped outside onto the small balcony of her apartment, where the air was soft and scented faintly with honeysuckle from a neighbor's trellis. The sky was streaked in gold and violet, the city glowing under it like a living map. FlowLogic was faltering, yes, but her life, her work, her heart no longer orbited its fate. Carter Dynamics was stable, growing, respected. Her team believed in her not as an extension of someone else, but as a leader in her own right. Cities were calling. Communities were changing. The systems she built were not perfect, but they were compassionate, grounded, and honest. Evan's world was cracking. Hers was blooming. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small, gentler part of her whispered a truth she would never say aloud. There had been a time when she wished he would rise with her, not fall because of what he refused to learn. She let that tenderness exist. She did not feed it. She did not deny it. Then she turned back toward her desk, where a new proposal for a multi-city collaboration lay waiting for her attention. FlowLogic's crumble was no longer her story to carry. The afternoon the offer arrived, Atlanta was wrapped in a soft, silvery rain. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention, no roaring thunder, no dramatics, just a steady, patient drizzle that blurred the edges of buildings and made the city seem to exhale. From the upper floor of Carter Dynamics warehouse headquarters, Naomi watched drops chase each other down the tall windows, leaving fleeting trails on the glass. The office was quieter than usual. Most of her team had left early, taking advantage of a rare lull between deployments. The hum of servers and the distant clatter of keyboard keys formed a muted backdrop as she stood with a mug of chamomile tea cradled in her hands, wrapped in a calm that felt both earned and fragile. Her assistant's voice gently cut through the quiet. Dr. Carter? Naomi, there's someone here to see you. Mia hesitated. She doesn't have an appointment, but she said you'd want to hear what she has to say. Naomi's brows lifted slightly. Did she give a name? Mia nodded. Sophia Lang. The name threaded through Naomi's memory with unexpected weight. Sophia Lang, one of the early institutional investors in FlowLogic. A woman with a reputation for being unnervingly perceptive, who favored long-term plays over glittering shortcuts. Naomi had met her only a handful of times in the early years, in crowded rooms where Evan did most of the talking and Naomi did most of the thinking. "Where is she?" Naomi asked. "In the front lounge," Mia replied. "Do you want me to reschedule for another day?" Naomi considered it. She thought of everything the name Sophia carried with it. The old life, the collapsed company, the shadow of Evan's increasingly public spiral. Then she shook her head. "No, I'll see her. Thank you, Mia." Sophia Lang was standing by the window in the lounge when Naomi entered, hands folded loosely in front of her, gaze turned toward the rain-slicked streets below. She was older than Naomi remembered, but only in the way trees are older. More rings in the trunk, deeper lines carved by seasons. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a low twist, and her dark suit, simple, unadorned, conveyed the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise her voice. "Ms. Lang," Naomi said gently. Sophia turned, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Dr. Carter," she replied. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. And please, call me Sophia. I think we've shared enough history to dispense with honorifics." "Then I'm Naomi," she answered, offering her hand. Sophia shook it, her grip warm, steady. "May we talk somewhere more private?" "Of course," Naomi said. "Come with me." She led Sophia down the hall to a smaller conference room, a space she preferred for meaningful conversations. Exposed brick walls, plants in the corners, soft lighting, a large wooden table that felt more like a dining surface than a battlefield. As the door closed behind them, the sounds of the office faded into a comforting hush. Naomi gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." "Thank you." Sophia settled into the seat with a quiet grace, then studied Naomi for a long breath. "You look well," she said. "Stronger." Naomi's mouth curved in a faint smile. "I've had practice." Sophia held her gaze, something like admiration flickering in her eyes. "I've been following Carter Dynamics," she said. "What you've built here, it's remarkable. Quietly so. The metrics on your last 3 city partnerships are the envy of half the firms I advise." "I'm glad the work speaks for itself," Naomi replied. "That was always the goal." Sophia nodded slowly. "It does, and perhaps that's why I'm here." The air thickened delicately. Naomi folded her hands atop the table. "Then I'm listening." Sophia took a measured breath. "You know FlowLogic's situation," she began. "At least the public version of it. Collapsing expansions, mounting losses, regulatory pressure. The stock price, well," she gave a small, dry smile. "It's become an object lesson in every risk management course I know." Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. The story was already written in headlines. "The board is fractured," Sophia continued. "Half of them still cling to Evan's mythology. The other half sees what I see, an organization that cannot survive on vision alone. They're looking for options." Naomi's heart gave a quiet, measured beat. She had been expecting this in some form, ever since the first cracks appeared. Still, hearing it out loud felt like watching a door open onto a familiar room she no longer lived in. "What kind of options?" she asked. "Leadership change," Sophia said. "Restructuring, partial liquidation, or..." She let the word drift between them, waiting. "Or," Naomi prompted softly, "or alignment with an entity that can restore stability and credibility," Sophia finished, her gaze sharpening. "A partner whose philosophy counters the chaos, whose presence alone tells the market, we have learned. We are different now." Understanding unfolded inside Naomi like a slow, luminous bloom. "You're talking about Carter Dynamics," she said. Sophia inclined her head. "I'm talking about you." The room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi's fingers curled, just slightly, against the edge of the table. "You're suggesting a merger." "I'm suggesting," Sophia said carefully, "a conversation about what might be possible. There are several on the board who believe that bringing you into formal leadership over a combined entity could be the fastest path to salvaging value for employees, investors, and the clients who still rely on FlowLogic's infrastructure." Naomi exhaled, the sound barely audible. You want me to step in and steady the ship that sailed away from me. Sophia's eyes softened. I want you to consider whether there is a version of this story where what you built, what you both built, is not left to rot under someone else's pride. Silence settled again, gentle but heavy. Naomi rose from her chair and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, casting the city in watercolor hues. She watched a streetcar roll slowly past, lights glowing softly, people huddled inside, moving through their lives unaware that somewhere above them, old worlds were being reconsidered. This would be complicated, she said at last, not turning around. Legally, structurally, culturally, personally. Yes, Sophia agreed, in every conceivable way. I've worked very hard to separate my life from FlowLogic's gravitational pull, Naomi murmured. To build something that isn't reactive to what happened, but independent of it. A merger risks blurring those lines again. It risks dragging ghosts into rooms where I've finally learned to breathe. Behind her, Sophia's voice remained calm, respectful. Then say no. Naomi glanced back, surprised. Sophia met her gaze. I didn't come to persuade you. I came to respect you enough to offer you the choice first. Before this becomes a conversation with other suitors who don't understand the soul of what was built in the beginning. Naomi's chest tightened, not with pain, but with a complex tangle of emotions. Memory, hurt, responsibility, a lingering love for the idea of FlowLogic, separate from the man who had refused to honor its balance. What happens if I say no? She asked quietly. Sophia folded her hands. The board will pursue other options. They may find a buyer who guts the company and sells it for parts. They may push Evan out and install someone with no understanding of why FlowLogic mattered in the first place. They may, she added softly, destroy what remains of the integrity underlying your earliest work. The words weren't a threat. They were a map of likely futures. Naomi turned fully, leaning back against the windowsill. And if I say yes? Then we begin a slow, careful negotiation, Sophia replied. One in which you decide what you're willing to take on. Perhaps it's not a full merger. Perhaps it's a targeted acquisition. Or a partnership that extracts certain divisions out of the wreckage and gives them a new home here. There are many shapes this could take. Naomi felt the weight of that reality. It was tempting, not as revenge, but as symmetry. As a chance to realign something that had been knocked off its axis. To protect the parts of FlowLogic that still held promise, that still touched lives in ways she had once dreamed of. And yet, she thought of her team in the next room, of the interns who looked at her with wide, hopeful eyes. She thought of the purity of the mission they'd grown together, of not needing to tether themselves to another entity's collapse to prove their worth. What would it mean to pull Carter Dynamics into the shadow of FlowLogic's failing star? Was that fair to them? To herself? Sophia watched her wrestle with the questions, her gaze kind but unsparing. You don't have to decide now, she said. I'm only planting the seed. The board will move soon, with or without you. I thought you deserved the chance to know that. Naomi's throat felt tight, as though she'd been holding too many truths there, afraid to let them all out at once. Why do you care? She asked softly. Truly. Sophia smiled, and for a heartbeat, Naomi glimpsed the younger woman she must once have been. Sharp, hopeful, stubbornly idealistic. Because I was there at the beginning, Sophia said. I watched you present models that impressed a room full of men twice your age. I watched you quietly correct assumptions that would have sunk the company. I watched you disappear from the narrative without protest, even as your fingerprints remained on every meaningful piece of the architecture. Her voice gentled. And as an investor, I've made my share of mistakes. But one of the things I refuse to do is underestimate the value of a woman who knows how to build and how to rebuild with integrity. FlowLogic could use some of that right now. The words settled in Naomi like a stone dropped into deep water, sending slow, widening ripples through everything she thought she had finished considering. At last, she nodded. I'll think about it, she said. Truly think about it. Not as a wounded ex-partner, as a strategist. That's all I ask, Sophia replied, rising from her chair. Whatever decision you make, I trust it will be the right one. For you, and likely for more people than you know. Naomi walked her to the door. The rain had stopped. A pale sun struggled through the cloud cover, casting a soft glow across the polished concrete floors. As Sophia stepped out into the corridor, she paused. If it matters, she said quietly, I would support you, in any capacity, whether you step into that mess or walk away from it forever. Naomi offered a small, genuine smile. It matters, she said. When the door closed and Sophia's footsteps faded, Naomi stood alone in the conference room, the echo of the conversation hanging in the air. A tempting offer lay before her, not of power, but of restoration, of reaching back into a past that had wounded her, to decide, on her own terms, which fragments were worth carrying forward. She turned back to the rain-streaked window, watching as a thin band of blue emerged between the clouds. For the first time since flow logic began to crumble, Naomi allowed herself to wonder, could she touch that world again without losing herself a second time? For days after Sophia's visit, the question followed Naomi like a second shadow. It sat beside her while she reviewed Carter Dynamics projections. It lingered at the edge of her thoughts as she listened to her team debate data architecture. It waited for her in the quiet moments, on her balcony at night, in the fading steam of her morning tea, in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. Could she step back into flow logic's orbit without being pulled into its gravity? At first, she tried to push the thought away. She poured herself into her work in Atlanta, into the cities that trusted her, the young minds who believed in her, the systems she was still gently reshaping. But every so often, a headline would surface, and the old world would knock once more at the door. Flow Logic announces asset sales to shore up liquidity. Board reportedly split on CEO's future. Core Infrastructure Division under review. That last phrase, Core Infrastructure Division, caught her eye like a hooked thread, because that division was where it had all begun. The routing engine, the predictive flows, the algorithms she'd written by hand once, when the future was nothing but a shared hope between two stubborn dreamers in a Detroit warehouse. Beneath the layers of reckless acquisitions and failed expansions, that original heart still beat. And it was that heart, she realized, that she could not bear to watch be carved up and sold to someone who saw it as nothing more than salvageable parts. The decision, when it finally came, did not thunder. It landed quietly, like a feather on calm water. Naomi was sitting in her office at Carter Dynamics late one evening, the sky outside deepening into indigo. Sheets of early reports lay scattered on her desk. FlowLogic's public filings, news of investor unrest, murmurs of potential buyers circling. Her gaze rested on a chart showing FlowLogic's business segments. At the top, global expansion and acquisitions, volatile, bleeding, riddled with red. At the center, core predictive logistics division, stable, underutilized, still quietly profitable. At the bottom, various experimental units, half-finished promises, and abandoned skunkworks. She lifted a pen and drew a circle around the central segment, the part of the company that still bore the shape of her mind, the part she could integrate into Carter Dynamics without corrupting its soul. The part she refused to let become collateral damage in a story that was no longer hers. She stared at that circle for a long time, then whispered to herself, more vow than thought, not a rescue, a reclaiming. The next morning, she called a meeting. The conference room felt smaller than usual with the 4 people she had invited. Her chief financial officer, her head of strategy, her legal counsel, and an unexpected but carefully chosen ally, Ingrid Halverson, CEO of Nordlumen, a Scandinavian tech ethics firm Naomi had quietly partnered with on several projects. Ingrid, with her thoughtful blue eyes and calm presence, had built a reputation on one guiding principle. Technology should never outrun responsibility. The 2 women had found immediate kinship. Now they sat side by side at the head of the table. Naomi outlined the situation with her usual clarity, tracing FlowLogic's descent not as gossip, but as data. She highlighted the troubled assets, the lawsuits, the leadership crisis. Then she focused on the circles she'd drawn the night before, the core logistics division. That, she said softly, is what still matters. Her CFO frowned thoughtfully. You're proposing a full acquisition? No, Naomi replied. I'm proposing a surgical one. We don't want the whole ailing body. We want the functioning heart. She clicked to the next slide, a preliminary structure diagram. Carter Dynamics plus Nord-Lumen, a joint entity combining their strengths. Naomi's infrastructural precision and Ingrid's ethical frameworks. Together, they would approach FlowLogic's board with a targeted offer. Acquire the core predictive logistics division. Leave the failed expansions, the speculative ventures, and the bruised corporate shell behind. Ingrid glanced at the diagram, then at Naomi. You don't want to save FlowLogic, she said quietly. You want to extract what's still alive. Naomi met her eyes. I want to ensure that the technology we built doesn't die of someone else's pride. Her legal counsel tapped a pen against a notepad. There will be resistance, she said. Evan will see this as dismemberment. Naomi's gaze did not waver. Evan made choices. The board must now make one too. This offer gives them a lifeboat for investors and employees in that division, at a premium over the fire sale prices they'll get if they wait. And for you? Ingrid asked. What does it give you, Naomi, beyond the business logic? Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that didn't tremble, she answered, It gives me the chance to steward what I helped create into a future that aligns with my values. Nothing more and nothing less. Ingrid nodded slowly. Then I'm with you. The others followed, not reluctantly, but with measured conviction. They saw the strategic brilliance, the ethical clarity. This was not revenge dressed in strategy. It was strategy refusing to be poisoned by revenge. They spent weeks shaping the offer. Valuations, transition terms, employee protections, commitments to preserve key teams and give them room to breathe within the new structure. Safeguards to ensure neither Naomi nor Ingrid would be constrained by FlowLogic's old politics. When the proposal was finally drafted, it was lean and elegant, like the work Naomi had always loved. No excess, no drama, just honest numbers and carefully drawn boundaries. She sent it not to Evan, but to the board. The response came faster than anyone expected. An emergency meeting was convened in San Francisco. Naomi and Ingrid flew out together, their planes slicing through a sky the color of wet slate. Naomi watched the city rise to meet them, glittering and bruised, remembered elevators and years of late-night lights and felt almost nothing. Not numbness, a calm distance. They arrived at FlowLogic's headquarters through a side entrance, escorted to a boardroom Naomi knew intimately and now entered as an outsider. The directors were already seated, fatigue etched into their faces. The air in the room felt stale, heavy with months of crisis. At the far end of the table, Evan sat with his shoulders hunched slightly forward, an unfamiliar tension shadowing his features. The confident ease he once wore, like a second skin, was gone. There were lines around his eyes she didn't remember, a tightness at his mouth that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Their gazes met for a brief, electric moment. There was history in that look. Love, anger, regret, ghosts of mornings and midnights and things that would never be again. Then Naomi broke the contact and took her seat beside Ingrid. The board chair cleared his throat. Dr. Carter, Ms. Halverson, thank you for coming. Naomi inclined her head. Thank you for hearing us. They walked the board through the proposal. Ingrid spoke of ethical realignment, of rebuilding trust. Naomi spoke of operational stability, of the long-term value in preserving and evolving the core logistics engine rather than watching it degrade under systemic collapse. Evan listened in silence, his fingers laced tightly together. When they finished, a murmur threaded through the room. It's unprecedented, one director said. It's elegant, another countered. Shareholders get a premium on the most salvageable asset, The rest we manage as best we can. And flow logic? Evan's voice cut through at last, low and brittle. What happens to the company when you carve out its spine? Naomi didn't flinch. She looked at him fully now, not as the man who had once held her heart, but as the CEO of a company facing choices he had set in motion. Flow logic, she said gently, is already bleeding from wounds you refuse to treat. This doesn't carve out the spine. It saves the part of the body that still remembers how to stand. A flicker of something, hurt, anger, something unnameable crossed his face. You're dismantling everything we built, he said, the words slipping between professional and personal. No, she replied, her tone soft but unyielding. I'm protecting what we built from everything you chose. Silence fell again. Heavy, absolute. It was the board chair who finally spoke. We cannot ignore the reality of our position, he said. This is the most rational offer we've received, and the most respectful to the people whose work created this technology in the first place. There it was, the recognition he had never wanted to put into words. A vote was scheduled for the following week. When it came, the motion passed. The announcement hit the news feeds within hours. Carter Dynamics and Nord-Lumen acquire FlowLogic's core logistics division in strategic deal. Whitaker's firm sells foundational assets in bid to stabilize. In poised realignment, original co-creator reclaims key technology. Journalists rushed to spin it as poetic justice. Analysts called it a brilliant move. Commentators spoke of symmetry and fate and the quiet ferocity of a woman who refused to disappear. Naomi granted no interviews. On the day the deal closed, she stood in a new office space, this one in a modest tower between Atlanta and the wider world, welcoming the first wave of transferred engineers. The people who had once written code under harried memos now stepped into her orbit with cautious hope. Your work isn't ending, she told them in a soft address. It's beginning again, under a different promise. Later, alone for a moment, she looked out at the skyline, the city below, the sky above, the strange, delicate balance of it all. She had not destroyed FlowLogic. She had extracted its living heart before the rest could drag it under. And for the first time since the divorce, she felt something inside her grow very still and very clear. This was not about winning, not anymore. It was about guiding what she had once loved, ideas, systems, possibilities, into a future that no longer depended on a man who had mistaken her strength for a threat. Naomi placed her hand against the cool glass, feeling the thrum of the city beneath her palm. A surgical acquisition, the analysts had called it. For her, it was something quieter, deeper, an act of reclamation, of the work, of the narrative, of herself. The building where the meeting took place was one Naomi knew well. FlowLogic's headquarters had never lost its gleam, glass and steel rising toward the sky like an answered prayer. But now, as Naomi stepped out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, it felt less like a monument and more like a relic, a beautifully polished shell that no longer held what it once promised. Inside, the lobby was as pristine as ever, polished marble, minimalist art. The same curved reception desk where she had once stood beside Evan, fingers intertwined, listening to contractors talk about timelines and occupancy permits. Dr. Carter, she turned toward the voice. The receptionist, a woman Naomi vaguely remembered from years before, offered a small, tentative smile. He's expecting you. Top floor, executive lounge. Thank you, Naomi replied gently. She moved toward the elevator with a measured calm that felt almost surreal. There had been a time when the simple act of returning to this space would have twisted something in her chest. But now, it was as though she were walking through a story she'd finished reading long ago. Familiar, but no longer binding. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper. As it rose, floor after floor slipping past, Naomi watched her reflection in the mirrored panel. The woman looking back at her was composed. Her natural curls framed her face in a soft halo. Her deep brown eyes were clear. The subtle gold at her ears and wrist glinted with each breath. She did not look like someone returning to an old wound. She looked like someone closing a chapter she had already outgrown. The doors opened. The executive lounge was quiet, bathed in the soft wash of late afternoon light. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Neo-San Francisco in all its glittering contradiction. And there, standing near the glass with his back half turned to her, was Evan. For a moment, she simply watched him. He seemed smaller, not physically. His broad shoulders were still there, his frame still tall, but diminished in a way that had nothing to do with size. The unshakable confidence that once clung to him like a second skin was gone, replaced by something tighter, more fragile. His suit hung a little looser. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes. His posture, though straight, held an invisible weight. He turned when he heard her footstep. "Naomi," he said quietly. "Evan." Her voice didn't tremble. Neither did his. But the air between them vibrated with all the things they had been, and all the roads they had refused to walk together. He studied her for a long second, as if reacquainting himself with a familiar constellation seen now from a different sky. "You look good," he said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. "So do you," she replied, and it was almost true. He looked handsome, yes, but she could see the cracks beneath the surface, the strain, the ways in which he had not yet made peace with who he had become. There was a small table near the window. He gestured toward it. "Do you want to sit?" "No," she said gently. "I won't be long." A flicker of something, hurt, passed through his eyes, then vanished. He nodded. "All right." For a moment, neither spoke. The city filled the silence for them, the faint hum of traffic below, the blur of sky cars, the distant shimmer of the bay. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said at last, forcing a wry smile. "You did what the analysts are calling the cleanest cut I've ever seen." Their words, not mine. "It wasn't about the cut," Naomi replied. "It was about saving something worth saving." His gaze sharpened. "Is that how you see it? Flow logic as some rotting carcass you salvaged organs from?" She didn't flinch. "I see it as a body that refused to accept it was ill until amputation was the only way to keep the heart alive." He winced at the metaphor. "You always did have a way of making the truth sound poetic and ruthless at the same time." "I had to learn from someone," she said softly. The words hung there, gentle in tone, devastating in implication. Evan exhaled, stepping closer to the glass. "You think I don't know I made mistakes?" he asked, voice low. "That I pushed too far, too fast? That I let the wrong people in and shut the right person out?" Naomi looked at him, her eyes clear, unyielding yet not unkind. "Knowing and changing are two different things." He swallowed. "I didn't call you here to fight," he said. I needed to say something. A few things, actually. Before the lawyers and the integration teams finish whatever this is between us, on paper." She waited. "At first," he began, "when you contested the settlement, when you filed those disclosures, I told myself you were trying to punish me, that this was about revenge, about making me pay for leaving." A faint, sad smile touched Naomi's lips. "Of course you did." His shoulders tensed. "I see now that wasn't it, or at least, not the heart of it." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, his gaze held no defensiveness, only raw, unguarded honesty. "You were protecting what you built, what we built, the part I kept convincing myself I had created alone." Naomi felt something gentle stir in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, not fully, but recognition that he had, finally, turned to face the truth instead of circling it. "I told myself I left because you held me back," he continued softly. "Because you questioned too much, slowed things down, made me confront the parts of my vision that were still fantasy." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out, those were the parts I needed you for most." She looked down at her hands, at the faint lines across her fingers, the lived years traced there. "You didn't leave because I held you back, Evan," she said quietly. "You left because I wouldn't disappear into your reflection." He inhaled sharply. Outside, a sky car drifted past, its lights reflected in the glass like twin stars. "I'm not asking for us to go back," he said after a long moment. The words were careful, deliberate. "I know that's not possible. Not after everything I said, everything I did, everything I didn't stop." His jaw tightened. "But I needed you to hear, from me, not from analysts or board members or gossip. I know I wronged you. Not just as a wife, as a partner, as a co-creator. You should never have had to fight this hard to reclaim what was always yours." The admission settled in the room like a soft weight. Naomi had imagined hearing some version of these words 100 times before, in all the nights she lay awake replaying the history of their life together. In those imaginings, the apology had felt like a key, something that would unlock a door, make everything make sense again. Now that it had finally arrived, it was different, smaller, more human, less salvational, and more simply true. She nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, quiet but genuine. That matters. Hope flickered in his eyes, a dangerous, naive hope that she recognized instantly and met with firm, gentle honesty. "But it doesn't change where we stand," she added softly. He swallowed. "I know." There it was, the line between past and present, drawn not in anger, but in clarity. Naomi stepped closer to the window, standing beside him now, both of them facing the city they had once dreamed of reshaping together. "Do you hate me?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. She considered her answer with the same care she brought to any meaningful decision. "No," she said at last. "I don't hate you, Evan." He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for the rest. "I grieved you," she continued. "I grieved the man I believed you were. I grieved the version of us that might have been, if you'd trusted that partnership doesn't mean surrendering yourself, only sharing the weight. But hate?" She shook her head. "No, hate would still tether me to you. I've worked too hard to live untethered." He opened his eyes again, and what she saw there was not the shining visionary the world had adored, nor the arrogant man who had walked out of their home with a briefcase full of exit strategies. It was simply a man who was finally paying the cost of his choices. "Are you happy?" he asked, the words tentative, almost reverent. A small, genuine smile curved her lips. "I am becoming," she replied, "and that feels better than happy. It feels honest." He let out a slow breath, the answer landing somewhere deep inside him. They stood in silence a moment longer, side by side, but not together. "You did it, you know," he said softly. "They keep saying you dismantled my empire, but you didn't. You built your own. And somehow in the process, you saved the only part of mine that deserved to last." Naomi's gaze stayed on the skyline. "You could still build something," she said. "Something that isn't about proving anyone wrong. Something that's actually about what you claim to want. Impact, not adoration." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "Without you there to catch me when I leap?" "Without needing anyone there to catch you," she replied gently. "Or learning to build your own net." He looked at her, and this time there was no plea in his eyes, only gratitude, threaded with a quiet, aching regret. "I don't know if I know how," he admitted. "You can learn," she said, "if you want to." The possibility hung between them, his journey now, not hers. At last, she stepped back. "I should go. Integration work doesn't happen by magic." He nodded then, on some old instinct, reached out as if to touch her arm. She stopped him with a look, soft, steady. "Goodbye, Evan," she said. "Not see you, not take care. A true goodbye." He dropped his hands slowly. "Goodbye, Naomi." She turned and walked toward the elevator, each step light, unhurried. At the doorway, she paused and glanced back one last time. He stood alone by the window, framed by glass and fading light, a solitary figure in a tower he no longer fully controlled. Once, that sight might have broken her. Now, it simply was what it was. A man in the middle of his own reckoning. Naomi stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft whisper. As it carried her downward, away from the high floors of her past, she felt no sense of descent, only ascent into a life no longer defined by how far she could rise with someone else, but by how fully she could stand in her own unshakable truth. Morning light swept across Atlanta in soft, golden bands, illuminating the city in a warmth that felt both new and ancient. From the wide windows of her office, Naomi watched the sun lift itself over the horizon, steady, unhurried, certain. It painted the rooftops, the old brick buildings, the lush pockets of green, the transit lines that whispered through the city's veins. She loved mornings like this. They made everything feel possible, and today she felt it more than ever. The integration of FlowLogic's reclaimed division into Carter Dynamics had officially begun. Engineers were settling in, datasets were migrating, code bases were being lovingly restored to life under careful hands. The air inside the warehouse headquarters thrummed with energy, curious minds, hopeful spirits, a sense of shared direction. People often talked about building companies in terms of milestones, funding rounds, product launches, acquisitions. But Naomi had come to believe true creation wasn't marked by those public announcements. It was etched quietly into the fabric of a team, into the first spark in an intern's eye, into the moment an idea once dismissed became a cornerstone of a better world. And that was where she wished to leave her mark. Not in the headlines, in the lives. She walked through the office that morning with her usual grace, exchanging small smiles and warm greetings as she went. Her team lit up when they saw her, and she never took it for granted. The way their faces softened, the way their voices carried respect without fear, the way they offered trust without condition. In one of the smaller labs, she paused at the sight of a group of young engineers huddled around a screen, debating predictive weight distribution for a pilot project. "Good morning," she said gently. They looked up. "Dr. Carter." "Morning. We've been testing the adaptive curves. Look." They moved aside, eager to show her, and she leaned in, listening intently as they explained their approach. Her eyes shone with quiet pride, not because she needed to be impressed, but because she saw in them the same fire she'd once carried into every room she entered. This was legacy in its most living form. After offering a few insights and encouragements, she moved on, her heart full. Later, in a different room, she met with former FlowLogic engineers, people who had survived uncertainty, layoffs, and restructuring, now finding their footing again under her leadership. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Ravi, lingered after the meeting. "Dr. Carter," he said quietly, "I just wanted to tell you, thank you." Before, the atmosphere was, he searched for a word, frantic, like we were always sprinting towards something that moved faster than we could breathe. Naomi nodded, understanding too well. "But here," he continued, "there's space to think, to care, to try things without fear. I didn't realize how much I needed that." Her smile was gentle, steady. People build better systems when they're not breaking themselves in the process. He exhaled, relief loosening his shoulders. "I wish FlowLogic had understood that." Naomi's gaze softened. "Some lessons," she said, "arrive only when we're ready to learn them." Ravi nodded. "I'm glad you did." She touched his arm in quiet acknowledgement. "So am I." As he walked away, she felt gratitude rise within her like a quiet tide. Peace didn't come from winning. Peace came from knowing you had used your strength with intention. By noon, she found herself in the top floor conference room, preparing for her interview with the Financial Times. They were profiling women who had changed the landscape of tech, not through force, but through vision. Naomi was one of 3 leaders chosen. When the journalist arrived, a poised woman with bright eyes and a recorder, Naomi greeted her with a warm smile. "Thank you for making time today," the reporter said as she set up her notes. "The world is fascinated with your recent acquisition. Many see it as an extraordinary reversal, almost poetic justice." Naomi shook her head gently. "I don't think business should be measured in poetry or justice," she replied. "Those are narratives that sound beautiful, but rarely build anything lasting. The journalist leaned forward, intrigued. Then what is your measure? Integrity, Naomi said, and impact. If my work doesn't amplify the people it touches, it means nothing. The journalist's pen paused over her notebook. Do you see this acquisition as a victory? Naomi considered the question with a thoughtful breath. No, she said at last. It's a continuation, not of what ended, but of what never should have been interrupted. Her tone was serene, grounded. FlowLogic's core technology matters, she continued, not because it was my past, but because it still has the power to change lives. Bringing it into Carter Dynamics isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about safeguarding a tool that can serve communities with dignity. And what about the personal side? The journalist asked carefully. The fact that this division once belonged to your ex-husband and now belongs to you? Naomi met her eyes steadily. Legacy is never about who you defeat, she said. It's about what you build and who you uplift along the way. The reporter didn't speak for a moment. She simply nodded, then pressed stop on the recorder. That, she said softly, might be the most powerful answer I've heard all year. Naomi smiled, a small, luminous curve of her lips. Thank you. When the workday ended, Naomi stepped outside into the warm Atlanta twilight. Cicadas hummed their evening chorus, and the sky glowed like a watercolor painting. Rose, lavender, soft amber blending at the edges. She leaned lightly against the railing of the small terrace outside her office, letting the breeze kiss her skin. The city pulsed with life below, thousands of stories unfolding in every direction, and she felt, deeply, the quiet truth she had earned. She was no longer surviving what she had lost. She was thriving in what she had created. Her legacy would not be defined by the man who underestimated her, but by the people who blossomed under her leadership, the systems she designed to protect the vulnerable, the cities she helped flow with more fairness, more thoughtfulness, more heart. Vindication was fleeting, but impact, true impact, echoed across generations. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and recorded a short message for her followers, something she rarely did, but felt right in this moment. Her voice was soft, close, intimate. Growth, she said, is not about proving someone wrong. It's about proving yourself right, about the person you choose to become and the work you choose to stand behind. If my story has touched you, if you've walked any part of this journey with me, I'd love for you to stay with me. Like, comment, follow. Let's keep growing towards something better. Together. She ended the recording, closed her eyes, and let the evening settle around her like an embrace. Naomi Carter had not sought vengeance. She had sought truth. She had sought purpose. And in doing so, she had built something far more powerful than a reclaimed division or a public victory. She had built a legacy, one she could carry forward without bitterness, one that would outlast headlines, heartbreaks, and the fragile pride of men who didn't know how to love the brilliance beside them. As the first stars flickered awake in the velvet dusk, Naomi stood tall, free, grounded, radiant in her own becoming. Her story had not ended with loss. It had blossomed into a future entirely, defiantly, beautifully her own.